All right, we are live. Welcome everyone as you trickle in here to today's webinar. I'm going to throw up a quick poll question. If you've joined our prevalent webinars before, we usually have two of them. So this first one is while you're waiting. What prompted you to join our webinar today? Maybe it's purely educational. Maybe you have a third-party risk management project coming up and you have questions and you want to hear from some experts. Maybe you're not sure where you're at, but if you want to learn more about global compliance requirements, you should stick around. Or maybe you're currently a prevalent customer. So thanks for joining us. All right, take a moment to answer. I'm going to go through a few housekeeping things and I'll introduce our host here. So you'll see Bryan Littlefair will be leading us to the majority of our webinar today, which is titled, Which Global Compliance Requirements to Use for Third-Party Risk Management and How. Bryan Littlefair is the CEO of Cambridge Cyber Advisors and past global CISO of Vodafone Group and Aviva. So thanks for joining us, Bryan. I hope you're having a lovely day so far. And this other lovely gentleman you'll see here, Scott Lang, he is Prevalent's own VP of Product Marketing. You'll be hearing more from him towards the end of the presentation. And so everyone knows we really want this to be interactive. So you are on mute and cameras are off, but please give us any questions that you have using the Q&A function on the bottom of the webinar here, or the chat function is fine as well. And just so you know, we will have some Q&A time at the end. So if you have any questions, please send them my way. I'll make sure to relay them to the lovely gentleman here. Also, this is being recorded, so if you have to hop off, you can't stay for the whole thing. It'll be sent to your inbox first thing tomorrow morning. All right, I don't think I'm missing anything else, so I will hand it over to you, Bryan. I hope you're having a lovely day, you as well, Scott, and thanks everyone for joining.
Great, thanks, Amy, and hello everyone. It's great to be able to speak to you all again, and hopefully some of you joined the previous prevalent webinars that I've done. I think this one's really interesting because, you know, compliance is only going to increase for all of us globally. And I think, you know, it's something we have to get comfortable with. And, you know, we all know how complex it can be to manage the supply chain. And when you overlay compliance and regulation on the supply chain, it becomes, you know, an ever increasing challenge. So we're going to try and unpick a little bit of that today and just trying to get into, you know, from my experience, what are some of the challenges I've faced and what are some of the things that I see consulting with my customers and clients as well. So we've already done an introduction of me, so that's great. We'll crack straight on. So I think, as I said, compliance is only going to go in one direction. You know, over recent years, I think the global compliance requirements have increased drastically. You know, I consult with some fairly big multinational organizations as well as smaller companies, but you know, if you are a large global multinational operating in several jurisdictions across the globe, then you're going to have a lot of compliance and regulatory requirements that you have to start to adhere to, and that is only going to increase. It's not going to go down. You know, a few years ago, security teams, in my view, were, you know, when you were doing supply chain assurance checks, you were ticking a few boxes, you were checking a few policies, you were getting some evidential data to give you some assurance over that they were doing what they said they were doing in their policies. And you were doing some basic background checks, who owned the company and all of those aspects. Now, I think we have to run a very complex process. It has to be near real time. We have to move away from the world of spreadsheets and Microsoft Excel. It definitely has a role to play in business Excel, but in my view, it's definitely not in third-party assurance. We have to get into the data. We have to be able to manipulate it in ways that a spreadsheet can't. For many organizations, I think, you know, the supplier footprint is huge and it's growing, you know, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, 5,000 suppliers within their supplier footprint. And, you know, that can be quite daunting in terms of having to slice and dice that, put them into the classical tiers and understand where to focus what will be a very finite level of resource, budget, capability within your organization to get to that, you know, golden panacea that everyone's aiming for, and holistically understand the risk profile that your supply chain presents back to the parent organization. But I still do see many people using spreadsheets. It's something that I see fairly frequently when we go in and consult and we talk about third party as well as other things. The dreaded Microsoft Excel comes out and, you know, several thousand rows long, several hundreds of columns wide, you know, that are used to encapsulate the information that's gleaned from the annual questionnaire that goes out there. And I think that's partly why we're getting a lot of regulation and compliance requirements coming through. You know, the regulation wants us to step up. It wants us to uplift the security of our organizations, and hence that's why they regulate. They say you have to do it this way. We want you to be better. We want you to improve how things are going. So I think we need to mature that capability internally. We need to accept that we have to get ahead of the curve on this. And I think that we all need to fully understand the supply chain, but we need to understand it on a daily basis, not an annual questionnaire. So I think what I'm seeing at the moment out there with my customers and clients that I consult with, I think the most fundamental shift I've seen over, say, the last decade is the best practice and knowledge sharing actually between the regulators. They used to be very siloed. You know, when I was running large global multinationals, they just didn't talk. There was no intergovernmental relationships that facilitated the regulators talking and sharing on how are they going to regulate their individual markets. But now what we're seeing is they are sharing, they're collaborating across the globe. Those that are more mature are flying their teams over to advise and consult in the countries that are developing in this space, and sharing their best practice information. You know, this is what we've learned on our journey. This is how we recommend you approach it. This is what we recommend you look for. Here's the results of our tests. So all of that information is being shared. And I think that can only be a good thing. And I think organizations are facing into this wave of new regulations while they're not really understanding all of their data, and a little emphasis on the all there, because often when I'm in organizations, they say, oh, we've got all of this structured data, but then there's this bucket of what they call the unstructured data, which, you know, no one dare touch because it's too complex. They don't understand it. It hasn't, you know, been able to be classified. They don't know what it is. They don't even know whether they should be owning it or hanging on to it. And I think that's the challenge. You know, the regulation is driving us towards understanding our full data sets, not just what we were able to classify through automated tools, but you actually have to understand all of the data that you're holding so that you can understand whether you can comply to the regulations. And I think, you know, third-party security is absolutely viewed as a critical process by most organizations, but honestly, not all. You know, we see some very mature organizations that invested in the correct processes, the correct tooling, the correct resource to be able to run this process effectively. But then we see some pretty big organizations and companies that are trying to run a third-party assurance program with, you know, 2 or 3 FTE, 2 or 3 people, and a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. And that's never going to get you to a point where you understand your risk position from the supply chain. And, you know, that under-resourced in terms of people and tools is a trend that I'm hoping starts to go away over time. And we're starting to see, certainly what we see within my company, we are starting to see people embrace the new technologies and capabilities that are coming out in this space. So that's really positive. And I think, you know, this slide highlights, you know, what we're starting to see in terms of some of the convergence. When I first started in security, you struggled to find any commonality between the regulators or any of the compliance frameworks. Everywhere you looked across the globe, they were different, and everyone was doing things differently. And actually, I think they were doing things differently intentionally. If one country wanted a widget red, the other country wanted the widget green, right? So it was very difficult when you were running, whether your compliance programs and your third-party assurance programs sit within the security function or they sit within the legal function. It doesn't really make much difference, but ultimately it was really challenging to understand, I have to comply to this legislation. I'm running a global business. How do I do that in this very complex regulatory landscape? And that was driving some challenging situations within organizations. But now I think, you know, one of the big drivers is global multinational organizations, and, you know, the proliferation of outsourcing and insourcing by particular countries and regions. That's really driven the start of convergence on similar regulatory and compliance frameworks across the globe. And I've just picked a couple here. You know, I assume it's a predominantly US audience on today. So things like CCPA, and then over in Europe, we have the GDPR. And fundamentally, they're trying to achieve the same things, which is good. You know, citizens want to be able to understand where their data is being used. I think that's purely sensible. And, you know, part of the reason why these regulators came in and actually started to enforce some of these rules is quite honestly, organizations weren't giving them that option. You know, it was quite hard to be able to understand what data an organization held upon you. It was quite a long, cumbersome process. And, you know, people want to have that choice. We're seeing that more and more. So, you know, the regulation comes in, it applies, to different areas and different regions. They all have their own nuances, but there is a significant overlap, which puts the power back on that citizen and back on that individual so that they can start to make choices around who has access to their data, how is that data manipulated or managed, and they have the right to opt out or opt in to certain marketing campaigns and other initiatives that they may or may not want to receive. And certainly one of the things that I learned, running security for large companies is when you look across the globe, privacy is quite culturally different. I'm not going to name individual countries, but when you go into one country, they regard privacy very, very seriously. And when you go into another, less so. So this is a very geographic challenge that we're having to crack. But certainly the key area that regulators are focusing on is data. And, they're taking a very sectorial approach, in my view. So certainly in the UK and Europe, it was the financial services sector that came under the spotlight first with a very heavy regulatory environment. And that is kind of fanning out in the critical national infrastructure, as we call it, into the various different areas, focusing on telecommunications, pharma, power, utilities, and all of those aspects, forcing an uplift in security in those individual disciplines. And that will proliferate out, obviously focusing on the big players first, but that is only going to trickle down into the smaller organizations. So if you are working for a smaller organization and think, well, this doesn't really apply to me because, I haven't got a 25 million US dollar revenue or etc., it will come your way. I'm very confident of that, but it's just they have to tackle the big fish first. And then obviously they're going to expect everyone to step up to be of a similar level. But there is, that global focus on improving data securities. But I think, across the globe, and I'll put a slide up in a minute that shows the kind of maturity focusing on data. I think lots of organizations, lots of countries are starting from a low starting point. Data security wasn't the big thing because privacy isn't the big thing. But I think that's starting to change with, the generations of, millennials that are coming through, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, etc., that are very, data consumers. They're very used to consuming data and interacting with that. So they're a lot more savvy around, well, I'm not comfortable with company X or company Y doing this with my data. I want to have control over that. And that's really driving some of the changes that we start to see. And I think it's safe to say, certainly from a company perspective, introducing compliance regimes like GDPR or CCPA has been a pretty fundamental shift for companies to deal with. It's not something easy and quick. It's not a tick box exercise that you just say, right, do this and do that. You have to really review your organization end to end to actually understand, well, how do we comply to this? What are our challenges? What do we comply to already? What are the gaps? And some of those gaps have taken a long time, certainly on the GDPR side, to actually be able to mitigate. It's meant a fundamental shift on how businesses actually work. And, certainly from a GDPR perspective, when people were saying they were compliant, they weren't actually compliant. It was a journey that they were on. They were moving towards being compliant and getting things done. And certainly from a US perspective, when we look at GDPR, many times when I go to access a US website, it throws up a banner and says, I see you're trying to access this website from Europe. We don't want to do GDPR, so we're not going to show you our website. And obviously in the US, I'm not sure whether you're aware that that actually happens, but it does. And, they'd rather just not have that visitor to their site than actually have to go through the headache of being GDPR compliant. Obviously, that's not the same for every US organization, but it does happen. It's frequent to see that banner pop up. So I think, the key theme that we're starting to see is, global data standards emerging, the right of the citizen to be in control and control about what that data, what that company holds on them, the right to decide what they want to do with that. And I think that's only going to proliferate as we go through. So we can see here a small section of the global compliance requirements that are in circulation at the moment, and for how every country and a region expands into that and starts trading with citizens in that country, then obviously you're going to come in scope with the regulatory requirements that are within that country. And referring back to that example in the US website, they don't want to comply to the EU GDPR regulation, so they're just going to block visitors from that region coming in. That might be fine for a website, but a large global multinational that wants to sell its products, sell its services, and interact with the citizens within those countries, they have to take a very different view. They have to embrace the letter of the law. They have to make sure that they're handling all of the data in line with those regulations. But I have a view, and I fully appreciate it. It's a view that not everyone on the call may share, but I think, regulation is a good thing, and we'll get into that a little bit more later in a little bit more detail. But regulators, in my opinion, are responding to demands from their citizens or responding to incidents or breaches. They see something happening, they're not happy with the progress, so they come in and regulate. They say, you have to do this now. If you want to continue operations, if you want to continue business, this is the way we want it done. And as I've said before, regulation isn't going to go away. So we need to equip organizations and our own internal teams with the capabilities and tools that enable them to effectively manage that risk exposure within their business. And that by default will satisfy the regulatory requirements. And I see all too often people actually just satisfying the letter of the law from a regulatory perspective. But in my view, and certainly in the teams that I've managed, we've took that as the bare minimum. That's the low point that we're going to achieve. But obviously we want to do the right things for our customers. So we want to be able to build upon that and actually show that we're heavily compliant to those regulations, not just at the bare minimum. So, here we can see, the maturity of one of the, the types of the countries around the globe. You can see, by the red, that kind of shows where there's heavy regulation in place. So you can see, all of Europe, North America, Canada, China, and Australasia regions. They have very strong, thorough processes in place to protect their data citizens. It wasn't always like this, and certainly before CCPA came in and GDPR, etc. I know that all of Europe would be drastically different colors, but a Europe-wide legislation, everyone had to comply, everyone had multiple years to get their organizations in place and make sure that the processes, the technology, the reporting, the governance, everything was in place. So I think this will start to color red as we continue to go on. Everyone is just on a different starting point from a privacy perspective and from a maturity perspective. The countries that I consult in and the companies that I work with, even in the African region where there's currently not anything in, there's stuff planned, starting from South Africa and maturing up in the whole African region. And I think, the fines is obviously the big thing that's driving organizations to comply. But actually, more and more, you're starting to see a maturity in the boardroom and actually say, well, this isn't asking for anything strange. It's not asking for anything out of the ordinary. It's making sure that organizations have effective governance over their data, that they understand what their data is, they understand who they're sharing it with. So logically, certainly in my view, it makes perfect sense. And if we talk about the GDPR for a few seconds, under the GDPR, the authority can impose some fairly significant fines. It's up to 20 million euros, which is, about $20.5 million, or 4% of the worldwide turnover of that organization in the previous financial year. So that's quite high. It can be quite impacting. And the GDPR came in before the CCPA, so it's been in effect since May 2018. And since then, we've seen around 800 fines issued across that European region that you can see in the center that's indicated red. And even though the UK has effectively left the Europe from a Brexit perspective, we are still governed by this GDPR legislation. And if you look at some of the big fines that have been handed out, the largest fine to date is Amazon. Obviously, they had a greater revenue than 20 million euros, so they got a 746 million euro fine. And they were fined for, making it challenging or difficult for users visiting their site within Europe to opt out of their cookies. It wasn't as transparent as it should be. It was hard, you clicked reject on the cookie site and you were presented with numerous complex screens to go through. Quite simply because Amazon focuses on collecting as much customer data as possible. And if everyone is just opting out of their cookies, it makes it more difficult for them to be able to comply. So that fine was levied upon them. But I think that, other countries are going to catch up. More fines are going to be issued. As I said, they're just on their own maturity journey. And as I said, I think this map is going to start to color up pretty quickly. So I have the pleasure of consulting and advising organizations of different shapes and sizes, as I said in the beginning, and third-party assurance is, it's one of their major problems on the agenda. It's often one of the key things that we discuss at boards. It's one of the key concerns of the security and the legal teams. And then that's for a reason, right? It's, you know, it's one of the most challenging risks to quantify and manage, depending on the process and the tools and the capabilities of the teams that you have. But if you actually link, you know, those challenges with the security bulletins that, you know, I read all of the security bulletins that come out from the security agencies. So whether it's GCHQ over here in the UK or NSA out there in the US, there's common themes emerging because, you know, we're all fighting against a common adversary using similar tools, similar capabilities, similar methods across the globe. So that messaging and communication obviously has, you know, some common messaging, which I've tried to capture in this slide. And we can't do a presentation this time of, you know, without mentioning the dreaded COVID word. And I think, you know, COVID has not only changed the way that the businesses operate with things like home working, but it also saw an unprecedented rise in security attacks. And, you know, that's a key theme coming out of the messaging. The attack level, the attack sophistication, everything kind of went up exponentially, and organizations were seeing their infrastructure scanned, their infrastructure probed, and obviously their homework is being phished or smished or vished, whatever you want to call it. But, you know, the attackers were having a heyday just because the organizations had drastically shifted. Their policies were effectively not relevant anymore because everyone was working from home. New technology was rapidly introduced. There was confusing but genuine messages coming out to employees in terms of, here's some new software you have to use, please change this process, etc. And that's a bit of a field day for the attackers because they can capitalize on that, and, you know, they can weave in their own messaging and say, we want you to do this. And you know, employees were more receptive to those manipulative messages whilst in the early days of home working and COVID, and certainly there was a lot more, you know, phishing emails and things floating around on the internet because of that. But ultimately, what they want to do, I often say that the target of every attack is the data. You know, ultimately they might want to monetize that data, or, you know, they might ask you for a ransom or a fine to get that data back. But even, you know, crypto locker malware spreading around organizations now, the modus operandi is to steal the data first, then encrypt it, because, you know, they found out that organizations are a lot more willing to pay if obviously you've got you're holding their data to ransom, you haven't just encrypted it. So, and the threat of disclosure on that as well. And I think the trend that certainly I'm seeing and I read in trade presses and things like that is, you know, the trend of parent organizations being targeted by their supply chain is only going to stay, and it's going to increase as well. And I think the perception is, and in my view, it's a valid one, is that why try and breach the parent organization to get hold of the customer data when a much smaller organization that probably has less security tools, less security capability, but they hold the same data. You know, in my view, that logic is sound. You know, if you're going to try and hack an organization, whether it's via its people or via its technology and circumventing its security controls, why go after this big beast that spends 100 million on security annually when you can target a smaller organization that doesn't spend that much, hasn't got as big a security team, perhaps hasn't got the right monitoring or governance in place, but they have that company's data. So, you know, that's what we're starting to see, that the hacks within the supply chain to access the parent organization's data. And I think that's going to grow exponentially in the future as well. And this is where, as security professionals or legal professionals and everyone on the call, we need that in-depth view of the risk and the threat that's within our extended supply chain. And it needs to be refreshed in near real time. As I said, when I first started in security, the Excel spreadsheets, the annual surveys and questionnaires, tools like Prevalent didn't exist when I was starting out. I'm showing my age, I'm only 44, but, you know, it's moved exponentially in that time frame. And I think, you know, we need to be able to slice and dice the data, and spreadsheets just don't give us that level of functionality. We need as much information. It needs to be as enriched as possible. We want to see risk scores on our supply chain. We want to understand technical policy breach information. Have they told us during our assessments that they patch external facing critical vulnerabilities within 24 hours? But, you know, we've got tools and capabilities that can see they've got a vulnerability that's externally facing and it's 4 days old. Information like that is really useful to actually put some context on, are they living and breathing what they say they will do on their policies, or do we have to pay this company a little bit more attention? Have they got the right capabilities to detect vulnerabilities and mitigate them? We want all of that open source intelligence flowing in. and we need it analysed on our behalf and presented back to our analysts in an actionable way. They haven't got the time to obviously pull all of this information and do the analysis themselves. It needs to operate like a SOC or a SIEM in some regards. The analysis is done by the platform and the tool, and they actually present an actionable list of information back to the third-party analyst. And a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet isn't going to do that for you. I think we're pretty clear on that. And I think, too many organizations that I see are still running what I call legacy processes. They're not adopting the advancements in technology and process and capability that I've just discussed that are there. You can actually use them. And what I see is a very stressed out third-party assurance team in a fairly large organization, daunted by the scope of organizations that they've got to somehow cover and actually get this information without using these tools that are available to them. But as I've just outlined, there is a different way, there is a different approach. And, I'm a huge advocate for organizations looking into tools like Prevalent that can actually help support them, not add to their data. Actually, it's reducing their data. It's actually helping them to hone down on the things that they actually need to look at, detect where the issues are in near real time and actually mitigate them or circumvent them. And that doesn't always have to be a cyber incident. We've seen lots of supply chain issues here in the UK that aren't cyber related. They're due to, various different reasons are touted around, whether it's the Brexit or whether it's, the impact of COVID, etc. But sometimes we're going into supermarkets and some of the shelves are empty, right? Organizations are struggling with supply chain issues. We've just had a real challenge getting fuel. People are queuing for hours in petrol stations. These are all supply chain challenges that need to be risk assessed. Can organizations mitigate those and model those before it actually becomes a reality and an impact for them? Another big one that we saw in Europe was the blockage of the Suez Canal. The ships couldn't get through, container ships couldn't get there. There was perishable food items on there and other things. So, think about managing risk in the supply chain. It doesn't always have to be cyber. You can model a lot of situations and lots of issues to actually, being able to understand, well, what could actually impact us as an organization, recognizing there's going to be several people in this call from multiple different sectors, etc. What could impact us delivering our product and service to our customer? And how do we understand if that presents a risk to within our supply chain? If we can't get our products from from supplier XYZ, what's our plan A, what's our plan B, and what's our plan C, and how do we mitigate against that? And I think, that's truly how you start to build that picture of risk. So let's look at some of the, foundational components that, I think are the cornerstones of an effective third-party program that can operate in this very complex regulatory and compliance world that we're finding ourselves in. First of all, I think you need to know your data. You look at any compliance or regulation framework, and they all of them require you to fully understand your data sets. You need to be able to categorize, slice and dice it based on numerous different fields and scenarios. Do they live in Europe? Are they in scope for GDPR? Are they a citizen of California? Are they CCPA? Have they set thresholds on their data permissions so that we can't use it? Have they opted in? Have they opted out? So you can't effectively comply, or you will fail an audit, or you'll get some significant, uplift required without you fully understanding your data. And I think you can't just do the easy bit. We talked about it earlier on, but I see it so often how people say that we understand our data, we've got it fully categorized, we understand the lifecycle management, etc. We're really good. But that's only on the categorized data. There's, petabytes and petabytes in some instances of data sitting in uncategorized data silos. And I think the regulation is there because that exists. And organizations need to really get a handle of, if it's uncategorized and they don't know a lot about it, then they're not life cycle managing it. They're not getting rid of it when they should have done. They're hanging on to it for too long, longer than they should be in some cases. And that can bring with it its own fines. If you're hanging on to data for too long when customers have left, etc., that can, bring just as big a fines from a GDPR perspective. So you really need to get into that uncategorized data set to find out the problems. And you need to understand your global vendor relationships, so emphasis on the global there. I see all too often organizations don't understand the global impact of a supplier on their business. So what might be a really small supplier in India might be the biggest supplier in the US. So that obviously impacts the level of attention and tiering that they need to have focus and attention on. So you have to understand from a supplier lens back into your parent organization, how critical is this supplier to us? What do they supply us in various different locations? And then obviously you can, leverage that not only from a cost perspective, but actually from a risk perspective, and understand how do we effectively manage the risk of this supplier within our organization. And then, the challenging piece is, a contract that was in place between a parent organization and your supply chain before the introduction of some of this compliance and regulation came along, it's not likely going to be suitable going forward, and it will ultimately need renegotiating, factoring in the new requirements. There are specific roles and requirements and clauses that need inserting in the contract. Who's the data owner? Who's the data processor? What requirements are imposed on each based on that role that they're holding? And, what happens from a contractual perspective in terms of, punitive fines and if those responsibilities aren't met. And there's a lot more than that needs factoring into those contracts. So I know it's a challenge, but those contracts need revisiting whenever a new compliance element comes in scope for your organization. But to be able to do all this effectively, you need to understand, well, what is my actual exposure to the regulation and compliance frameworks? And whether it sits within the legal function, the risk function, the compliance function, the security function, it doesn't really matter. But actually, you need to understand, where does my business operate? What type of sectors do we operate in? And therefore, what am I in scope in? And we need to get guidance from the business. This shouldn't at all be a security silo organization or process that's been run across the business. If all of those areas exist within your company, you should be chatting to legal, you should be chatting to risk, compliance, security, IT, finance. This is a business problem. It's not a security or IT challenge. It's how does the business comply to these requirements? So absolutely, we need to break out of the security silo that some organizations view third-party risk as a security process. It's not, it's a business process. And I think, all too often I see fairly large organizations that haven't appointed a DPO. And, and this is, in my view, is more common on the state side, because not much of the regulation actually mandates, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but CCPA doesn't mandate that you need a DPO, whereas GDPR does. And I think that DPO, the data privacy officer, is such a critical role. Someone who is the champion or the custodian of data within your organization, that has the say of where it flows and has the say of how it's manipulated and used and sold on, etc. Someone needs to have it as their full-time role to actually understand data within your organization. We often say it's the lifeblood of the company, so it's important enough to have someone allocated to protecting it and make sure that we're doing the right things with it. I think this can get complex very quickly. A large company that's operating in maybe 60, 70, 80 countries across the globe, you can have a very large compliance exposure. So how do you manage that? And, I've worked in organizations that have had that footprint, and, it's pretty challenging in terms of what you do. But I certainly mandate the approach of keeping things simple. They have to be effective, but equally they have to be simple. I often say, complexity is the enemy of security. If something is completely complex, it's going to be difficult to secure. And I think, the structure I certainly drive through security organizations is that we have our security policies, we have our security guidelines, we have our security standards, and that all translates into our control environment. And it's that control environment that we want to try and standardize as much as possible across the globe. You don't want to be running different controls, because controls are audited. If you have a different control environment in different countries, then you have to have people that can audit that control environment in that country, and it becomes highly complex when you magnify that by 60, 70, 80 countries. So in an ideal world, ultimately what you're aiming for is that this control environment would satisfy your global compliance requirements. So whether you're operating in Singapore, in China, in the US, in the UK, France, Germany, etc., and places in outside of those geographic regions, your control environment would satisfy the requirements of those legislative environments and those regulations and controls. So let me explain what I mean here on a slide to kind of bring that to life. So I've worked in organizations when I've joined that have had, numerous different conflicting security policies and standards, and that's translated into numerous different control frameworks. And that's not a good place to be. So, when rolling out global initiatives, something as simple certainly in my past, it was something as simple as video conferencing or messenger applications. You'd rapidly run into a security policy that would restrict that, or it couldn't be done in way X, Y, Z, in country X, etc. So you can't operate in a world where you have individual country policies. Certainly what I'm starting to see the most mature organizations is if they have a standard global policy. The only two changes that are allowed to be made are language, so it can be translated into local language. And if there is something absolutely unique from a legislation or a requirement perspective that it doesn't make sense to globalize, then that can be added to that individual country policy. But that'll be one or two things. Everything else is standardized across the globe. So the approach that people are taking, in my opinion, and certainly the clients that I consult with, where it can possibly be achieved, and where it isn't going to introduce a significant operational overhead, where there isn't a significant cost implication, where it makes business sense to do, we will standardize down on that single global process. An example might be, from the top of my head, how quickly do you have to notify the regulator of a breach in one of the countries versus another? And that does differ widely. If you go over to the MAS in Singapore, you've got 24 hours, others you've got 48 hours, etc. So how are you going to run your global business? You need to be able to make sure that you're complying to that global regulation, because you might have a Singaporean resident's data existing in another country, and that breach may occur in that country. So you have to be able to comply to that. So if you take all of your control environments up to those most stringent levels and roll that out across your business across the globe, you're only doing one thing: you're uplifting your security to the tightest requirements. And I think that's a really easy thing to sell internally, because it's the right thing to do for your customers. And I think, more and more, if I look at how large organizations are constructed, I think it has to be done this way. Most big organizations have created shared service centers, in high skill, lower labor cost regions, should we call them that, or captives, and they run key business processes. They run finance, data center operations, security, etc. But they're processing the data fundamentally of your global client base, or operating systems that do that. So you have to therefore ensure that these facilities meet the requirements of that local citizen. So you have to be able to elevate everything up to that most stringent level and run your global business that way. And I think that's what the more mature organizations are doing, to keep things simple and to remove a lot of the complexity out of running, a global compliance program. And I think, looking at three of the common mistakes that I see people making, we've touched on this a little bit. I think you have to go beyond the minimum. We always, certainly the CISOs and the chief procurement officers and people I chat to, they see the regulation as the minimum. It's the low bar, the low point where you should pitch yourself. And you're constantly striving to improve and overachieve on that, because, I have this view that if it's the right thing to do for the customer, if the customer was sitting in the room when you're making the decision and you're saying that you're going to just keep it at a low level, you're not going to go up, would they be happy with that? Or would they be more happy saying, okay, we're seeing regulation as the low point, but we're going to invest and we're going to make sure that we're constantly maturing above that level? And I think your customers would be happy with that statement rather than the other one. And I think regulation extends to where the data flows. That's a really important point. That's why we talked about revisiting the contracts. It's so important to understand, have the people that you've contracted to do work, have they further subbed that work? So is there fourth and fifth parties in play, and therefore what's their security capability, and do they have satisfactory controls? And do you, as the parent organization, have your data owner, data processor fully set up, and is there contractual coverage in place from a financial perspective? So we have to follow the data. It's almost like a river. You have to understand where all the tributaries come off, where is it flowing, etc. You have to be able to visualize that and understand that, and have that codified into your supply chain assurance to make sure that you've got the right governance and processes in place. And obviously it's around being too manual. Prior to tools like what we're talking about today, and Scott will talk a little bit about Prevalent in a minute, prior to these tools being available, manual audits was the approach. And you used to be able to kill and cripple an operational team by saying, right, you've got your ISO audit today, you've got your 27001, you've got your PCI audit next week, you've got internal audit coming in to look at the controls framework, then you've got PCI, ESS, and then you've got GDPR, etc. It just continues to grow running, a large global multinational has, 6 or 7 tier with 4 data centers, that can be quite a challenge for the operational teams to cope with that level of auditing. It's a lot easier to click a button and actually understand, from a supplier perspective, this is where we are from a governance, this is where we are from an insurance perspective, this is what we know already. And if you need to delve a little deeper, that's fine, but the tools can tell you a lot of information that you're going to go and look for already. So coupling this information with your internal GRC platforms then becomes really, really powerful. And I think, there's a bit of a mixed bag on regulation. So, why do we have regulation and compliance there? Some people think it's too little, others think there's too much, death by regulation, death by 1,000 cuts, etc. It can be too overbearing. My view is you have to think why that particular regulation was established in the first place. And I've seen several organizations, security teams, struggling to obtain budget, struggling to get the right resource, needed to be able to manage the risk that they effectively have under management. And regulation honestly helps. Coming from a CISO perspective, it's a lot easier conversation to go into the board and say we need X, Y, Z budget because this regulation says if we don't do it, then we won't be able to operate the company. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. So, regulation can help drive focus and attention to uplift the level of security in particular sectors or, particular countries or regions, depending on what the regulation is. So over time, that increased regulation has actually led to an increased level of capability of security. Organizations still have challenges and issues. Of course, we read about that in the newspapers and on the papers every day, but, it's uplifted definitely drastically over the time period that I've been looking at. But I think there has to be a limit. And by that, I mean, a completely compliant company in a heavy regulatory industry can still be prone to a cyber attack. And, so regulation, that we have to draw a line somewhere, we have to strike a balance. And I welcome the regulators personally and compliance bodies collaborating globally, because I think, harmonization of those requirements across the globe will only make that more simpler for us all to comply to that. So let me summarize a few of the key messages before I hand over to Scott, and he can talk a little bit about the prevalent platform. So I think we're all clear, or certainly I am, and you can challenge me in the questions, but whether we're managing the supply chain for security, whether we're managing the supply chain for compliance or regulatory requirements, our objective is to reduce our risk exposure. And that might be from cyber attack, or it might be for some of the other examples I gave, like the Suez Canal, so from a business continuity perspective. But fundamentally, it's all about risk reduction. But this is another area of security that's never going to be complete. We often say in security that the job is never done. The journey is not going to be finished. There's a constant evolution and churn within the supplier footprint. So we have to keep, driving those processes and making sure that they're done. So we have to keep focusing on that risk exposure. We have to keep driving down the tiering of our suppliers and making sure we've got that global governance and capabilities. But we have to go easy on our teams by investing in the right capabilities and tools and processes. We can automate some of these processes heavily now and present, analyzed results back to our teams without them having to go out with spreadsheets and Microsoft Excel. So we need to be able to embrace that technology that's available to us. And we have to work more closely with our suppliers. And, I more than most understand the challenge of that, when we're actually looking at, thousands and thousands of suppliers. But there's suppliers and there's suppliers. There's people that are obviously really critical to your business, whether they run your data center or interaction with your customers, etc. And we need to turn those suppliers into partners, right? We need to fully understand their business. They need to fully understand ours. And, the contract can help with that, but then the contract needs to go away. If the contract comes out at every interaction and meeting, then we've got a bit of a problem. We need to mature that relationship so we can have sensible conversations about how we uplift the joint capability within our various different organizations. And I think we've already established, this is broader than the IT and the security team, the legal function, the risk function, the procurement function. I did a whole webinar on how the procurement function is the CISO's best friend. So you should look that up, because I think there's such commonality and around, viewing this whole area as a business risk rather than an IT risk. Something that I see all too often is that people view this as the CISO's problem, and it's not. It's a pure business problem, and we need to break out of that security silo and embrace those broader functions within the business. And then again, I'll say it again because it really needs hammering home, because complying with these regulations and compliance. If you don't know your data, you're not going to comply. So get underneath that structured data, and that's typically what the regulators are asking you to do. And then adopt the process of show me, don't tell me. All too often in the past, it was right. Yes, we do this. You don't need to look at our processes. We've got this. We manage our vulnerabilities effectively. You don't need to come and look at how we do it. Now, the more mature companies go into the process of, I don't want you to tell me, I want you to show me. I want the evidence, I want the assurance, I want that uploaded into my platform so that we can actually see that those processes and procedures are being followed. So I think, once bitten, twice shy is the approach. So you don't want to be told, you want to be shown and see the evidence that that's actually going on. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Scott, who's going to talk to you a little bit around the prevalent platform, and then obviously we'll be happy to take questions at the end. Thank you very much. Scott, over to you.
Cheers, Brian. Thank you. That last comment on Brian's last slide there, I think, is the perfect segue into a little bit about what I want to share with you about prevalent, and that is the show me, don't tell me. And, the process of gathering information and evidence and policies and procedures and due diligence from your suppliers and partners and third parties. I mean, I'm not going to paint a rosy picture here. It's soul crushing. I understand that. And it can quickly spiral an already over stretched team down into oblivion without the right help. And if you've got to prove that your third parties have policies in place, security related, data protection related, or others, you have to find a way to automate the collection of that information, the analysis of that information, and then the presentation of it, both to your internal auditors as well as the external folks who are going to want to ask questions about it as well. And frankly, that's what we specialize in. The prevalent third-party risk management platform is a solution that helps you centrally assess all of your third parties according to the specific requirements you have to, assess them against and report against as well. Collect that information through the completion of, their assessments and the uploading of supporting evidence. The review of that information, and then ultimately the recommended remediations to get them to a place that you're comfortable from a risk perspective. You're never going to eliminate all the risk. We know that risk never equals zero, but to get somebody down to an acceptable level of residual risk is the objective of the exercise. And then we can help you, take the time and the manual labor and, the sweat and more, out of that process by taking it on your behalf. We address third-party risk at every stage of the vendor lifecycle, not just the collection of compliance evidence to support some sort of a regulatory conclusion, but we help companies get intelligence on their potential vendors in the sourcing and selection phase. As you intake and onboard a vendor, we can give you visibility into their existing risk profile as well as some real-time risk insights, give you some inherent risk visibility against whatever metrics you're trying to measure against. Execute those full and complete assessments. I think we've got 75 questionnaire templates built in the platform that you can leverage now, from a GDPR assessment to a CCPA or CPRA assessment, HIPAA-related assessments. There's a NIST framework or so, and then some in there. There's ISO questionnaires. The platform's got a library of them to draw from that you can pick and choose. You can be flexible with. You can build a custom one. We've even got a standard survey that you can ask and then map the answers back to whatever requirements you need to on the other end. So the whole process is meant to simplify that excruciating process of collecting that due diligence and just make it easier to manage. Next step is monitor and validate. Once you have the information in, the answers from your suppliers and partners, you've done a bit of review, and now it's time to really do some controls validation. We can leverage some existing cyber business, reputational, financial monitoring, and then have our experts get in there and just do like a controls validation exercise to make sure that that their reported controls map to your requirements. Measuring performance and SLAs. Brian mentioned earlier on in his presentation, that not every risk is a cybersecurity risk. The Suez Canal blockage being a great example of that. You may have suppliers that have some reputational challenges. Maybe they're not living up to their expectations from an environmental, social, or governance perspective. And you need to have some visibility in that, because those can be risks to their ability to deliver to you, which is your ability to deliver to ultimately your customers, if that's the case. So managing SLAs and performance metrics goes hand in hand with security. And then finally, the last piece of the equation that is way too often overlooked is offboarding. Every relationship is going to come to an end, and it can't just be simply flipping a switch and walking away. There's quite a bit of checklisting and processes and data destruction and offboarding or terminating of assets and whatnot that have to be followed through. And one of the values of our platform is that we can help provide that process, that automated workflow-based process, to guide you through that workflow, so that when that relationship ends, you have greater levels of assurance that that the right steps have been taken. Next step, please, Brian. We offer several benefits at every one of the the stages of the sales cycle that I mentioned there, which you can kind of easily understand from the previous slide. But I'll leave you with this piece down at the end. Third-party risk management isn't just for the cybersecurity team. Brian talked about that. We talked about it a second ago on the previous slide. It's also about managing risks throughout the vendor ecosystem that might be, reputational, business related, financial related, their ability to deliver, whatever, which means third-party risk is going to be important to all kinds of different teams throughout your enterprise. If you're in the security team, great. If you're in the, the risk management or the compliance, internal compliance and audit team, great. Procurement's going to want a hand in this as well. One of the significant values that we deliver as a solution set is that, we can bring together all of these different teams under a single pane of glass. Everybody's looking at the same data, getting the reporting that matters to them, and can take the appropriate actions, act on that data accordingly. Next slide, please. I think it's the last one. We address use cases from procurement to IT security to legal to compliance to frameworks. Each one of these items on this screen represents a specific assessment or questionnaire that we have built into our platform, which then maps to a compliance report that you can provide to your internal teams, external auditors, whatever, to help demonstrate the progress toward achieving whatever compliance objective you need to. And on that right-hand side, we've got all of our 3-letter acronyms and even a few 4-letter acronyms cooked in there as well. But just an idea of how we specifically help you show, not just tell, of the current security posture of your third parties. Awesome. And then just to wrap up slide on our approach here, everything I hope you learned just now was that our goal is to help make you smarter in third-party risk with all of the data that we have in the platform, help you unify not just yourselves but your internal teams to coordinate action and look at all the same data, and then finally be very prescriptive in your process. That's it.
Great, thanks, Scott.
All right, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Brian. So a couple of questions came up throughout the presentation, a lot of acronyms and some questions regarding it. I did my best to try to answer some, but I told them I would relay the questions to the expert to make sure that we're right. So the first question is, what does POPIA stand for? What does it mean? And what country did it originate from?
So that is, I can't remember exactly what the acronym means, but essentially POPIA is CCPA and GDPR in Africa. So it's a South African country, right? So.
Got it. Okay, I did a quick Google and I said Protection of Personal Information Act. It seemed
that's the one, yeah.
All right, we have a couple more questions. I'm going to throw up our last poll question as I ask these, just in case you have to hop off. We're really curious if you're looking to augment or establish a third-party risk management program in the coming months. Yes, no, I'm not sure. We are here to help, as Scott mentioned a little bit. So I'm going to leave that up as we continue on with some questions here. The next one is regarding slide number 7. I'm sure that pops right in your mind there, Brian, regarding the processes that require near real-time governance. I think it was the second to last bullet. They are looking for some clear examples.
So many organized, which one? Sorry, to manage complex processes require near real-time governance. Well, from my perspective, it's around, threat. So if you're looking at an organization that is fairly critical to your process, if you're running what I'd call a legacy spreadsheet-based process, then you're not overlaying the threat angle. So, you would be blindsided if one of your organization is appearing on CNN or Sky News because they're having a data breach. So overlaying that threat intelligence over those processes allows you to actually get those insights a lot quicker, and being able to, pivot internally from your organizational perspective to actually drive that. So that's what I mean by near real time. So you want to be able to understand what's going on in your supply chain in near real time. It's never going to be real time. Obviously, someone has an issue, etc. But if other customers know about it, you want to know about it as well. You don't want a communication flow to go through a relationship manager and then up to his manager and then come through the trail and then you find out about it eventually. You want to find out about it in near real time. And I think that's what these tools and the overlays with the threat intelligence, that's what it enables you to do, right? Have your finger on the pulse on what's going on within your supply chain.
Got it. Thank you, Bryan. All right, next question. Are there GDP certified or CCPA certified for IT application products or IT third-party vendors to reconfirm their baseline compliance, such as privacy data encryption at rest, at transit, etc.?
Yeah, so I think, from a software perspective, absolutely. And that's certainly where you're going to start to see the world going. So if a company has to comply, then, there's going to be accreditations for individuals, there's going to be compliance for software and, and solutions that businesses can consume. So that's natural flow that we've observed throughout time. So, and that's what companies will demand. If I've got to comply to GDPR, then I need people within my organizations that can be certified to not just make sure that we are complying to it, but do the assessments and the audits, because you don't want to find about you not complying when the regulator comes in to do their audit. You want to test yourself. So you need people, you need software that can able to give you that level of assurance to actually say, yes, we are complying. And obviously from an encryption perspective, that needs to extend into your supply chain. If your stance is that, we're going to encrypt all of our data, end to end throughout our entire process, etc., then you need to be able to validate that is in place. And there are solutions coming into the market now that can help you, validate that even within the encrypted data sets without actually having to decrypt. So that, it's going to get a little bit more exciting.
All right. Thanks, Bryan. All right, one last question I'm seeing here. What are your views on identifying and assessing regulatory requirements during SOC 2 audit for a global organization, as privacy is one of the trusted service principles in the auditing process?
Yeah, I think that, it's a very good question. And I think, from a SOC 2 perspective, it's demonstrating your capability to other organizations that, this is how seriously you take security and all of those aspects. And I think, that's where regulation can actually help you, being able to fully embrace, live and breathe things like ISO, GDPR, etc., and various other compliance regimes that might be implying to you. It's a lot more powerful SOC 2 report, if you like, rather than the assessment, to actually be able to present to potential clients and say, look, this is how seriously we take security. So if you look at, an Amazon or a Google or an Azure SOC 2 report, it's fairly impressive in terms of, their embracing of the letter of the law in the compliance and the regulations. But as I said, they built upon it. So you don't just see the tick box, you see how far they've gone to assure you that, they are the best cloud services provider to put your data in, etc. And I think that that's going to become a bit of a differentiator for people using their SOC 2 reports to actually say, look, we haven't just complied to the standard, we've gone over and above. And I think that that will become a bit of a choice for customers in terms of where they want to put their data, right?
Got it. Thanks, Bryan. One last comment came in. So regarding third party, I know that we focus a lot on third party being with, prevalent, and this being a prevalent webinar, but they're saying organizations GRC has many more components, including policy management and etc. Not really a question, but just a comment that I wanted to make sure was passed your way.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right, and I think prevalent would be the first one to admit, and other people in this space as well, that, it's an information augmentation, and, many of the customers that Prevalent will be speaking to will have an Archer or some similar solution in place as part of their GRC platform. And, that will still be the core platform to manage risk. But you know, third-party risk is a portion of that risk that you're actually managing, and this can really help to augment that data and do automated workflows between them. I'm sure, Scott, you see that all the time with your customers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we've got customers of ours that leverage one of these, you know, big GRC platforms that are a mile wide and an inch deep. And, you know, they leverage Prevalent when they need the domain level expertise in third-party risk management to augment, you know, their overall, you know, GRC. You know, a lot of those GRC platforms are great at managing organizational enterprise level risks, but by their very nature, they just simply can't go, you know, 1-2 levels deeper in specific domain areas, which is, you know, why people choose Prevalent.
Yeah,
Right.
makes sense. In addition to that comment, if they're using Archer, do they have it all, or do they still need Prevalent? I know you touched on that a bit, Scott. Is there anything else you want to add?
Yes, you need Prevalent. Absolutely, yeah. No, you know, Archer, outstanding solution for enterprise risk management. It's been in the market forever, but you know, like I said, you know, its specific third-party risk management capabilities great, but you know, we're a domain expert in that area and built a solution from the ground up that, oh, by the way, integrates with Archer. So, you know, if that's a concern for you, definitely, you know, reach out and, you know, we're happy to explain how that happens.
Awesome. Yeah, well, thank you. I think that's it for questions this end. I know we're just going a little bit over the hour here, but if you have any other questions or want to chat with an expert here at Prevalent, you can email info@prevalent.net, follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter. We post a ton of great blogs and webinars that may be helpful for you. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you so much, Brian. I learned a ton, learned a little more about acronyms myself. As a reminder, everybody, this is being recorded and will be sent your way tomorrow morning. All right. Thank you both. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody. Have a great one.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye now.